You know, the holidays are a very busy time, and as we approach this year's season, we'd like to hear about your experiences working the holidays as a healthcare professional. So please, share your stories with us, tell us what you've learned, and you might just be featured in a very special RX for Success holiday episode. Just visit rxforsuccesspodcast.com/contact-us. That's where you can leave us an email or a voice message. We'd really like to hear from you. So do it today.
Paging Dr. Cook. Paging Dr. Cook. Dr. Cook, you're wanted in the OR. Dr. Cook, you're wanted in the OR.
Welcome to the Prescription for Success podcast with your host, Dr. Randy Cook.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Prescription for Success. I'm Dr. Randy Cook, your host for the podcast, which is a production of MD Coaches, providing leadership and executive coaching for physicians by physicians to overcome burnout, transition your career, develop as a leader, or whatever your goal might be. Visit MD Coaches on the web at mymdcoaches.com because you're not in this alone. And don't forget, CME credit is available when you listen with us. Just look for CMFI in the show notes to learn how. My interview guest today is Dr. Benjamin Gilmer, a family medicine physician in Western North Carolina, and the author of a fascinating new book, The Other Dr. Gilmer: Two Men, a Murder, and an Unlikely Fight for Justice. It's a fascinating read and a great example of just how truth really can be stranger than fiction. So let's hear my conversation with Dr. Benjamin Gilmer. I'm looking forward to a fascinating conversation today with Dr. Benjamin Gilmer, who is up in Western North Carolina, I believe. You know, looking at your CV, Benjamin, I'm not sure exactly where you're located now, so why don't you tell us that to get us started?
I am in Asheville, North Carolina.
And are you still associated with the Cane Creek Clinic that I read about in your book?
Yes, I work for the Mountain Area Health Education Center, which is in Asheville, and I see my patients at a small little clinic outside of Asheville called Cane Creek.
They are very fortunate to have you, at least by my assessment. You have a fascinating story, and I really want to get to the subject of your book. But before we get into that territory, we really like to talk about the origin story. And I'm interested to know when you first got interested in studying medicine.
I became very interested in medicine at an early age because my father he ran the pastoral education department in Charlotte at the hospital. And so I was always running around the hospital as a boy and saw patients like through his experience, like hearing about them. And then when at age 16, I told my dad I wanted to work in the hospital. He said, okay. So he put me called his friend at the hospital, and I worked for the summer in the kitchen, washing dishes.
That's a good place to start.
So that was my first experience. And then I told him the next summer that I really wanted to do something different in the hospital. And so I started working in the emergency department. And I did that for, 10 consecutive summers. So throughout undergraduate school and throughout high school, and then started doing research for the Department of Emergency Medicine.
So you knew what the inside of a hospital looked like and how it worked?
I roamed every inch of the hospital as a teenager. I did.
And so then you started your undergraduate education at Davidson, graduated in 92, as I have it, with a degree in neurobiology, psychology, and French. It's not the typical curriculum that we find for someone headed to medical practice. So you want to talk about that a bit?
I was confused. I was confused about the world, and I wanted to learn everything, and I still stay true to my goal of going into medicine, but I became deeply fascinated with neurobiology, and so that really prompted me to delve into studies that ultimately ended up with doing a master's in neurotoxicology. And then after Davidson, I went to France for 2 years and learned that I could go to med school for free. So I was teaching in a public high school in France, and then went to the Sorbonne during the evenings for med school for 2 years. And that was a really great opportunity just to sort of test my, how bad I wanted to be in medicine. And then came back
What'd you learn?
to,
I mean, were you convinced at that point?
I was. I mean, I was also like deeply intrigued by what teaching looked like because I was teaching in high school and was confused a little bit about what my path would be. And so I came back from France to finish my master's research and taught in a high school in Charlotte for 4 years. And that really empowered me to want to be a teaching doctor. So then I applied again in North Carolina and finished my studies here with the intention of being an academic doctor, which I'm doing now.
Yeah, indeed you are. You got your MD in 2006, as I have it in my notes, and make sure to correct me if I'm wrong. You went ahead and did your family medicine residency right there in the MAHEC system. What I want you to do is give me the words behind all these initials in MAHEC.
MAHEC is the Mountain Area Health Education Center. So we're part of the AHEC system that exists throughout the country. In fact, MAHEC was the very first AHEC in the whole country, and we're probably still the biggest AHEC organization in the whole country. So we're responsible for distributing and providing health education to the 18 counties of Western North Carolina, west of Asheville.
So that's where you did your family medicine residency, and it sounds like it must have really agreed with you, and you decided that you wanted to stay in that area when you got into practice. And as I understand it, you had the place picked out where you wanted to go, but there were some questions involved when you applied for that job. So you want to go ahead and tell us about that?
Yeah, we came to Asheville from moving from New York City, where my wife was working at the time, and with the intention of like really planting roots here, because we've grown up in Charlotte and always loved this area. So it was such a natural fit, and the people that were leading the department were people that I sought out as mentors. So it was a perfect fit for us, and we wanted to stay, and I wanted to join the faculty, but the only faculty job available after graduating was this new tiny little clinic 18 miles outside of Asheville that was the first sort of satellite clinic for MAHEC. And it was just getting on its feet after having been closed for several years, for about 4 years, and was struggling to kind of prop itself up back as a clinic. And so I went to the board and told them I wanted to consider this job. And during the interview, I learned that many things. I learned that the clinic was struggling and that they were resuscitating it because the previous doctor who had started the clinic was serving a life sentence in prison for killing his father. And then I learned that we shared the same name, the same last name. So hence was born a more than decade-long journey to try to understand what all that meant at the time. And at first they didn't want to give me the job. They were concerned about
I was going to comment on that. I learned in the book that you had a lot of enthusiasm for being in this place. It seemed like a good fit for you. And even when your interviewers suggested that there could be some potential problems, you seemed to be unfazed at that point. So enlarge on that a little bit. Tell us a little bit more about what they were thinking and what you were thinking.
I was thinking that I just wanted a job. I was ready to get my career started. I had 2 young children and mountains of debt to pay, so I was ready to get started and excited to be in a rural community and to be at a site where one of my other friends was Mike Coldonato was also working. And I didn't pay any attention to this other Dr. Gilmer. I didn't know what had happened to him. I knew there was a murder of some sorts, but at the time I really didn't care. I just wanted to get my life going, and this was the perfect opportunity to keep one foot in academics, and then another foot in terms of just learning how to be a doctor.
And I would imagine that you were thinking, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that you might have been thinking this grisly murder happened several years before, and you would have thought that perhaps nobody's really talking about this anymore. But that turned out not to be the case, didn't it?
Well, that's right. I mean, the murder had happened like 5 years before. I just didn't see how it related to me at the time. And I certainly didn't extrapolate what the implications could be. I was just trying to move forward until I started hearing stories about the other Dr. Gilmer, and his name was Vince Gilmer. And because I inherited many of his patients, and they all wanted to talk about him. They wanted to share stories about him because they had never really had the opportunity to talk about it and share stories with anyone else.
Did that surprise you at all?
No, it didn't surprise me because, I mean, my name was Dr. Gilmer. I mean, some people thought that I was like some kind of reincarnation of him, or maybe I was a brother or a cousin, or people were confused. I had precipitated panic attacks in patients and others who heard my name and turned and left the building. So, people who thought that maybe he had gotten out of prison. So his presence was like still palpable in the building. It's a small building. It's only about 1,300 square feet. And you walk in there and you can feel that there was another life in that clinic before us. I mean, he was the guy who built the walls in that clinic. Mm-hmm. And so it was no surprise to me that they wanted to talk about him. But I was surprised that what they said about him was that he was a beloved doctor. And some of them even asked me to be more like him. They really saw him as like such a gem of a doctor that they just couldn't stop talking about his presence and his humility and his desire to be proximate to the community and to, he never paid attention to the clock. Like he was just fully present with his patients. And they loved that about him.
And
so
how did
I started
that affect
taking notes.
You?
Well, I thought it was a little strange, at first that they would be speaking so, like their words would be so endearing. But, and I thought it was strange too, that all of a sudden I was starting to compare myself to him because he was kind of a template for what that community wanted. And I was realizing that, I had, come from a bigger city and, I didn't grow up in Western North Carolina. So, I was like an outsider and trying to listen to, I was trying to be open to listen to their stories and their stories were affecting me. Stories begged me to want to know more about him as a person. And as a neurobiologist, I wanted to know more about what happened to his brain. Like, how could this good doctor, how could he have done such a horrific act, to kill his father? And he did it quite brutally.
Yeah.
So I was deeply curious about what happened to him and ultimately decided that I needed to know more.
And one of the things that I loved the most about the book is, it's one of these events that makes you think, how can this be a random event? But it seemed to me the event that really began to get you over the inertia and get you started in this investigation of the other Dr. Gilmer was a conversation with a fellow that you met at the farmer's market. Am I reading that right?
So I did meet a gentleman at the farmer's market who was sort of Vince's right-hand man, who was a little bit anxious to talk to me at first. But, this concept of like, was this coincidence? Was this fate? I soon began to sort of experience it as fate. There were so many intertwined like elements of the story that, for example, like in 2003, my first clinical rotation in medical school, I was hoping it would be in the emergency department where I felt comfortable. But instead, they threw me in Broughton Hospital, which was originally called the Western North Carolina Insane Asylum, but now it's one of our public hospitals that provides care to the severe mentally ill for all 20 counties of the western part of the state. And so that summer, I discovered many things. Like, it was my baptism in medicine and discovered what mental health looked like. But I also discovered a man on the geriatric floor whose name was Dalton Gilmer. And that man, I didn't know anything about other than he had been residing at the hospital for a year or two, that he could no longer walk, that he was mostly demented. And that was Vince Gilmer's father. And so
Wow.
I met him the year before he was murdered, before he was killed in 2004.
That is way too amazing.
So that's really where this story began for me. And it was powerful to recognize that our paths had crossed, before I went to residency, before I got this job, before I started learning about Vince Gilmer, the other Dr. Gilmer.
We'll get back to our interview in just a moment, but right now, I want to tell you about a new sponsor for us. Growing Innovation Health Solutions is a comprehensive medical billing service that allows you to shift the burden of collections off your shoulders so you can focus on patient care. GI Health Solutions has the experience and the expertise to help you manage all your billing-related chores efficiently and professionally. Their expert team will handle all your coding, claim follow-up, and billing issues to be certain you receive your payments on time. They can streamline your billing process and increase your revenue by up to 30%. With GI Health Solutions, you'll get more time with patients, less busy work, better cash flow, fewer errors, and improved patient satisfaction. So reach out to Growing Innovation Health Solutions today and let them help your medical group improve profitability and eliminate administrative burdens. Visit their website at www.gihealthsolutions.net for a free consultation. We'll get back to our conversation in just a moment, but first I want to let you know about a great gift idea from MD Coaches. You can actually give the gift of coaching with an MD Coaches gift certificate. All you have to do is let us know the amount you'd like to give, and we'll issue a certificate that your special someone can redeem for a coaching session or sessions whenever they're ready. Just visit us at mdcoaches.com to get started. And now let's get back to our conversation. We'll get back to our interview in just a moment, but right now I want to tell you a little bit about Physician Outlook. If you haven't discovered this remarkable magazine, please do so very soon. It was created by physicians, for physicians, to showcase the intersection between clinical and non-clinical interests, whether it's writing, painting, cooking, politics, and dozens of other topics. Physician Outlook gives a physician perspective. It's available online and in print. It's really unique among physician lifestyle magazines. And like the Prescription for Success podcast, Physician Outlook amplifies the voice of any physician who has something to say. It also engages patients who still believe in physician-led, team-based care. And Prescription for Success listeners can get 3 months free when you enter our promo code RX for Success and select the monthly option at checkout. That's a really great deal on this stunning publication. And now let's get back to today's interview. So at that point, you were clearly interested enough to want to explore the whole story much more deeply. And I happen to know, because I've heard the interview myself, that you were visited by a fairly famous radio journalist, Peabody-winning radio journalist, Sarah Koenig, who actually wanted to publicize the story. Tell me about that event.
So Sarah, who's an amazing journalist, who's also responsible for the Serial podcast, which is the number one listened to podcast in the history of all podcasts, she called me and said, "Hey, I heard about your story through my cousin. Like it was my cousin saw her and met her and said, oh my gosh, you're not going to believe what's going on with my cousin. He has this crazy story that's happening." And she asked me if I wanted to do a story, and I said, no way. That was the last thing that I had on my mind at the time, because I was starting to feel a little paranoid about what was happening after hearing from another patient that the other Dr. Gilmer was getting out of prison, and that I would be an easy target for him because I had sort of assumed his life and stolen all of the things that he cherished, like his practice. And so we were,
in spite
really,
of the fact that you knew that he had life without parole, you were a little worried about your own safety.
Well, I didn't know that he had life without parole at the time.
I
I
see.
hadn't investigated that. I just knew he was in prison, assumed he would be there for a long time, but didn't know any of the details.
I
And so
see.
this sort of set off this chain reaction of like paranoia that lasted for a while. And ultimately I decided that, well, in order to continue practicing at King Creek, I had to either figure out what happened to him. I needed to go meet him, or I needed to leave. Like one of those three options needed to happen. And so I later called Sarah back and said, Sarah, I would actually love your help to really dig deep into this story, because it would be nice to have, a journalist help push me to get to the details. My life was sort of spinning out of control at the time with two young kids and trying to learn how to be a doctor and new academic pressures. Like it was a challenging time. I think all physicians relate to those early years of medicine when you're just trying to figure yourself out and figure out a practice and keep people alive. Like it's an intense time. And
It's a lot of
discovering that
pressure.
I was walking in the footsteps of a presumed cold-blooded murderer with the same name made it even more tenuous. So I asked Sarah to come and to dig in with me to do a 6-month inquiry into what happened. And that's what we did. We sleuthed together for 6 months.
Well, that must have been pretty exciting. Did she like move into town, or did she visit periodically? How did that whole process work?
She came to Asheville several times and spent a couple weeks with me in the clinic. And, we went to Virginia many times together to dig up court records and do interviews. And then ultimately we went to the prison to meet Vince Gilmer, which was
and I'm interested to know, was that your idea? Was it her idea? Was it sort of a mutual, let's do this thing? How did that come about? It's pretty brave, by the way.
Well, I don't know how brave it is. It was something that, if you're going to do a deep inquiry, you have to go to the primary source. And I wanted to meet him. And, I was really fearful about it for a long time. Like I built up this sort of image in my mind, sort of torn between this ghost-like figure and this beloved doctor figure, and was kind of stuck in the middle, not knowing exactly who this person was.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote him a letter. I finally heard back from him. And, the letter was written in like childlike writing that was like a madman's scrawl. And I could barely decipher some of the words, but the last two words that I could decipher were "please help." And
Wow.
At that point, I knew that, we couldn't tell the story without going to meet the other Dr. Gilmer, to meet Vince.
Sure.
And so that's what we did. And that was very revealing.
And let me ask one other thing about the prelude to your first interviews or your first meetings with Vince Gilmer. Were you aware at that point of the nature of his trial, this trial that sent him to a life sentence where he was trying to defend himself? Were you aware of those details before you met him?
No. I mean, I knew that he had a life sentence. I knew that he strangled his father and mutilated his hands. I knew those things, but I knew that he had fired his lawyers and represented
Mm-hmm.
himself pro se. But I didn't read the transcript of the trial at that point.
And so tell us a little bit about that first meeting.
Well, for anyone who's gone to a prison, you can recognize that it's an uncertain experience. One that for me was a big one, because I had lived a very sheltered life up until these days as a privileged person who grew up with all the amenities that he needed for success. And, most people who live in the suburbs don't go to prisons. And so it was a big awakening moment for me to see what a prison looks like to be inside of a prison, to see the souls who live in those walls, and then to finally meet Vince Gilmer and to hear more about his experience. So I was very naive up to that moment about what mass incarceration was, what the prison experience was, and understanding the dichotomy between what people on the outside believe about prisons and what life inside prisons actually are, challenged by the notion that, what we think might be rehabilitation is non-existent in most prisons. And so it was shocking. I was very nervous, like that first visit, and part of it was just like the unknowing of not knowing what to expect with the other Dr. Gilmer. But he finally sort of made his way up to our table while Sarah and I awaited him. And the person that I imagined was not the person we discovered. What we discovered was this much older appearing, frail man who was, stooped over, who had these like dyskinesias, or these shaking gestures in his hands and in his face, and who was really struggling to communicate. Like he was struggling to walk, he was struggling to communicate. So it certainly didn't match up with this, this cold-blooded murderer title, which the judge had given him after they swiftly convicted him. And so then the story really started to change, because I started to see Vince Gilmer, the man, now as someone who was clearly a frail person who was just barely surviving prison. That was the first visit. It's interesting because during the trial, they deemed that he was clinically a malingerer, that he was faking the same symptoms that I was witnessing. And during that time, he fired all of his lawyers. So that would have been the most lunatic-ridden thing for any person to do for your own murder trial, of course. And it was interesting because the way that he was described during his trial was exactly what I was seeing in person. And so his symptoms were very consistent with what they had described back in 2004.
Did that precipitate any profound surprise on your part that a person could have behaved in the way that you were seeing before your own eyes, and yet a judge would allow him to proceed to be his own attorney? Did that surprise you at all? It surprised me a lot when I read the book, and one of the first questions that I had at that point. So I'm wondering what your feelings were at that point.
Well, at that point, I hadn't read the trial, but it completely surprised me after Sarah and I immediately went back. We went to the courthouse, we pulled the trial, and we both read all 800 pages of it. And after reading the trial, I was completely blown away, because his behavior during his trial was nothing short of delusional. And, he was full of multiple diagnoses that were never made. In fact, the psychiatrist or the psychologist who evaluated him said that he had no known psychiatric illness whatsoever. And that was just patently untrue. So it dawned on me that at that point that, the judicial system doesn't really think the way we do as physicians. Like everybody has their role in a trial. The defense attorney has their role, the prosecuting attorney has their mission, which is to prosecute, and the judge gets stuck in the middle along with the jury. And there are lots of different forces that determine how someone will be perceived. How the jury is made up is everything in a murder trial. And for Vince, he had the cards stacked against him because he didn't have a lawyer. That was his choice. But that should have signaled, to anyone that he was unstable. And then to hear his words, his spoken word during the trial it was nothing short of like just being completely farcical.
And to further underscore that, the people who were in charge of prosecuting him were seeing the same things that you're describing. You weren't there present, but you read this man's words. So, the prosecuting attorney, the constable in the county where he was arrested, and all those people who were in charge of building the case were seeing exactly what you read about later, and they drew a completely different conclusion. Do you? In fact, I heard, I think he was one of the law enforcement officers on the Sarah Koenig interview, explicitly said again and again and again that he had no doubt that this man was a cold-blooded murderer. So back to my question, does it surprise you in any way that they were able to maintain that attitude in spite of what they were seeing right in front of them?
No, it doesn't. It's surprising, like through the retrospective scope, but what's not surprising is that we are all laden with, internal intrinsic bias about things. Everyone is biased. I later became biased because I thought that Vince Gilmer had a traumatic brain injury, and that's what likely affected his brain and turned him towards this delusional behavior. But like prosecutors, they have their biases. The detective had his bias, and he had good reason to have some of these biases. None of these people were clinicians. The psychologist is not a physician. The psychologist had his own biases. He had been studying, and his academic niche was malingering. So that inherently like pushed him in that direction, I think. But I think this question of like, where do our biases come from, and being aware of our intrinsic biases, that's really important. So when when I think back upon it, I don't think that the detective was not trying to do his job. He was very much trying to do his job, as well as the forensic psychologist. Everyone was doing their job, but we're so protected by our own left hemisphere, by our own biases, that these mantras that are spun over and over, and the truth can be very hard to discern sometimes. So I don't want to be accusatory towards those people. I think they were actually doing the best they could. But when you look back at Vince's case, you start to realize, wow, this person was really biased in that direction. Benjamin Gilmer was really biased in this direction. And then came the psychiatrist who later became a person in a new prison that Vince visited, who inherited Vince as a patient after he tried to commit suicide in prison. He was really free of his biases. And he was able to look at Vince with a new perspective, with a sort of tabula rasa perspective. And that was really refreshing to me, to see this man who had been practicing forensic psychiatry for almost 50 years, and to start a relationship with him, looking at Vince in a different way. But in my mind, this kind of underscores the importance of our process as physicians, because as physicians, we are all deeply biased as well, but our intention is to do what's best for the patient at all costs, and to advocate for our patients. And we try to free ourselves, I think, from factors that really influence what we do with patients. I mean, we're certainly bound to many, of course, but I think as a practice, our ability to see things through a clinical lens helps us to see patients in a way that's more pure, that's free from some elements of bias. And that was the approach that I was trying to take with Vince, to see him in that way.
So we understand that it was not immediately apparent to those people who were in charge of prosecuting the case that Vince Gilmer was a sick man. But as time went on, his symptoms began to worsen, and it seems that nobody ever asked the question, aside from you, as to whether or not we might have made a mistake here. And I think that's probably the most disturbing part of the entire story to me, and that is, I can see where a mistake could easily happen in a case of this sort. Prosecutors are paid to prosecute as vigorously as they can. Vince essentially didn't have anyone representing him, so it's easy to see how that could have gone wrong. But later on, as his mental status began to deteriorate, still no one seemed to take interest except for you. That bothered me a lot.
Well, thank you. We should all be bothered a lot because of this. And what became very apparent to me after meeting Vince for the second time, so Sarah and I went back to meet him, except for this time I took a friend with me rather than Sarah, who was a psychiatrist. And I wanted him to see Vince through his lens. And it was very apparent from him that he was not a sociopath. He was not a malingerer, that he was very ill and likely had a neurologic disease or some other disease. And so that enabled us very quickly to run through a list of diagnoses and to come up with Huntington's disease, which we proposed to the prison. And we were able to get him tested for that. And it came back positive. And so what's more disturbing is that after you realize that a patient, a prisoner, an incarcerated person, once they have a disease like that, you would think that it would be easy to get them out. Or you would think that maybe people could change their opinion or their original biases about Vince, but that was not what happened. And in fact, most of the people dug in even deeper, and including the detective, including the judge. The judge, after we put this out there on the radio, was inflamed and went to the governor of Virginia and tried to get the psychiatrist in the prison fired. And ultimately, he was fired.
This was the judge who presided over the original trial?
This was the judge who presided over Vince's trial. So, that's an example of, well, that's vengeful behavior, which I couldn't understand why he would do that. But I think he was probably trying to silence what was happening. But, so I've gone back over time and talked to a lot of these people, including the detective and the forensic psychologist who evaluated Vince and people in the prison. And, it's so interesting. Once an idea is born, once a belief is born and sort of consolidated in someone's mind, it's really, really hard to change that belief system. This is what we're seeing in politics in America today. That even though you understand what the truth may be, if you have a belief system that doesn't correspond with that belief, it's just so hard to change. So many of these people still believe that Vince is a cold-blooded killer and not someone who is sick. And this is one of those unusual situations where Vince's mental illness and his neurologic illness was determined by a genetic test. So we can't do that with all psychiatric illnesses, but with this one we can. So there's 100% certitude that Vince has this illness. And there's, in my mind, 100%, certitude that he should not be in prison, and that physicians, should be the ones who can call that out, because we know that treatment for these very complex neurologic patients just cannot be delivered, appropriately in prison.
So I think if we stretch ourselves, we can understand that perhaps those people who originally prosecuted this case were in a state of mind where they just really didn't want to be wrong. They didn't want to admit that they had sent someone to prison for doing something that they didn't really have any control over. And I can understand that. I don't like being wrong. But when you went the next step, when you went into the territory of asking for review from the higher authorities, like the governor of Virginia, it really didn't go any better, did it?
No. So this was a big turning point for me as a young doctor who was trying to understand what my role in this process was. I thought that we would be able to easily liberate him from prison and put him in a hospital. That was what I thought was the best scenario. And so I put together a legal team, and we started to put together a clemency petition. We had to await Governor McDonald, who was the current governor of Virginia at the time, because he was being indicted himself and was actually charged and was heading to prison himself until the Supreme Court threw out his case. And, so from the very beginning, I started to realize that this process was not about the Hippocratic Oath. And it was not about rehabilitation, nor was it about punishment. Vince had already been in prison for a decade at this point in time. And, I learned that this was really about politics, and that getting him out of prison was going to be a political game. This was a big wake up for me, because I just didn't see, I was naive really to the forces of what keeps people in prison and what puts them there in the first place. So we applied for clemency. We waited the new governor, who was a Democrat, Terry McAuliffe, and he waited 4 years, and then on his last day in office rejected our clemency petition. And at that point, their sort of understanding was that Vince wasn't sick enough, that he needed to be sicker before they would let him out. So then we had to wait another 2 years and await a new governor. And we were so grateful, because the next governor was Governor Ralph Northam, who was a neurologist. And this was like, I thought the stars were aligning that this was.
Yeah, that must have felt like a home run.
Oh, it felt like a home run. We did. And then we waited 2 years for him. And 6 months before his last day in office, he rejected our clemency petition. And then I was completely lost. I thought that I just could not understand any of their reasoning until I started diving a little bit deeper into the politics of Virginia and some of the things that were going on with the parole board and how that influences the way people are let out.
Can you share some of that with us? Because I would really like some enlightenment. I just don't get it.
Well, I didn't get it either. I mean, the lawyers were always more pessimistic than me, but essentially, I mean, there are always forces at play within any state, within any governor's mind as they're doing the risk calculation. And the risk calculation at that time was that the parole board had let someone out of prison early before their sentence was over, and that person committed another act of murder. And so it created a harsher environment, a more conservative environment where they were just more cautious to let anyone out after that.
So much for blindness at the scales of justice. Well, Benjamin, listen, this is just an incredibly tragic story, and I'm just I can't say enough nice things about how well you told it in the book. And I do want to encourage our listeners to go out and get the book. It's worth every minute that you spend with it. And it's certainly, sometimes we can be a little loose with our assessment of life-changing moments, but it really caused me to have some significant changes in the way that I look at the world. And I think it's a great read that'll be very much worth it for everybody. And I want to encourage people to get the book. I have really enjoyed this conversation with you. And in fact, I'd be happy to sit here for hours and hours, but reality won't allow that. And what I think we'll do at this point is I'll back out of the way and let you go ahead with what we brought you here for. I'll close my mic, and audience, Dr. Benjamin Gilmer is going to give us his personal prescriptions for success.
Randy, do you mind if I say one more thing real quickly about?
Sure, go right ahead.
About the book. And this is something that's important to me to, I think, encourage other physicians to pursue their own advocacy journeys and to speak out and to write and pursue justice in everyone's personalized way. But the book for me was a unique way to kind of put my mind in a different place, like to sort of experience the more creative side of that I've sort of forgotten about as a doctor. And I say that because I think most of us as physicians know that we live on the left side of our brain all the time. Like that's where we reside. That's what it takes mostly to keep our patients doing well. And like the book for me was an opportunity to sort of escape some of that and live into a creativity that I hadn't experienced in so long. And it became a tool. So I didn't write the book, The Other Dr. Gilmer, because I didn't write it because I thought that I was a good writer or because, I wanted to create some kind of entertainment for people. I wrote it because I wanted it to be a tool for advocacy. And luckily it ended up in the governor's office and many people hopefully read it there, but someone read it there. And it was within a week of getting everyone in the governor's office a copy that the governor decided to reverse his clemency rejection. And so at that point, he granted the clemency appeal and Vince became, at least on paper, a free man. It's just another example of how our system is broken and why it's so important, I think, for doctors to be spokespeople for advocacy and because people listen to us. They see us as, we're some of the last remaining voices, I think, in our country where people see us as bringing authentic, truth-telling stories that are intended to be stories of change. And so I feel that's what compelled me to write this story was to do that, to use the book as a story as an agent of change.
Well, Benjamin, I really appreciate you sharing that with us, and I'm really delighted to know that you finally got the outcome that you were looking for. It sort of restores my faith in humanity, and I was really looking for something like that after I read the book. So, thank you again. And at this point, good place for us to allow you to speak on your own and give us your personal prescriptions for success.
Thank you, Andy. Well, it does feel a little audacious to be giving you my prescriptions for success, but this whole book process has taught me many things, and one of the things that it's taught me is a framework that I've used very personally for sort of a pathway towards advocacy. In a way, it sort of frames up my pursuit of writing this book, trying to tell Vince's story, and trying to be trying to bring a new voice, a new clinical voice for advocacy in regards to why we incarcerate the mentally ill. And the way I think about this is that the first sort of gateway to success, and that could be however you define success, but for me, it's curiosity. Like the first step is curiosity. And I feel like as family doctors, this is something we do really well. We remain deeply curious about things. We try to expand our focus or our spectrum of care. And, I think for anyone, who maintains curious for a lifetime, it just keeps your practice fresh. And it keeps, preserves your sort of childlike eyes in a way. And that's really important to have a continual self-discovery. So for me, being curious about Vince is an example, being curious about this process of mass incarceration allowed me to enter into a better understanding. And it's continued to sort of fuel this sort of passion that I've developed for advocacy. So that's an easy first gateway. Number two would be to develop a process for inquiry. And, we do this well in medicine. Like all physicians and allied health providers, like this is like one of our niches is delving into a process of inquiry, whether that be for a patient. For me, it was sort of developing a pursuit of journalism in a way, and being open to what that journalistic process was. And in terms of writing the book, like that process of inquiry took years. After the podcast, that was just a blip in terms of this prolonged kind of process of inquiry. And that's really important, I think, to have time to develop inquiry, not only into others, into our patients, but to also, be more self-reflective and, to think about ourselves. And I want to say that, as physicians, this is something we don't do very well. It's really easy for us to inquire into others, and it's much, much harder to turn that lens back on ourselves. And for me, writing this book was a deeply intentional process of personal inquiry, as well as inquiring into Vince Gilmer. Once you enter that process, I think this step number 3 for success is being open to transformation. And for me, that was the prison, like going to the prison, being transformed by what I saw, i.e. the tragedy of what mass incarceration means for most people, especially those 40% of people who have severe mental illness who are incarcerated. That's about 800,000 people in America who represent that group. And so, because we work so hard in medicine, being open to a moment of transformation is often also very hard. If we sort of flip it or pivot away from thinking about these stories that we hear from our patients as an opportunity to learn, it makes us more available to be transformed by something. And Vince was that very poignant moment for me to really have my heart changed, to be shifted from my original belief about what incarceration was and what punishment was. So that's really important. Step number 4 for me was having an opportunity to vision. And this can be also very hard for us as physicians, because we just don't have time to vision. And, it's no secret why 63% of physicians are burned out today. It's because we we don't set aside time to vision. And I've been very complicit in this too. Like I have not been an intentional visioner until this book, like this writing process, really forced me to vision and to think about this problem in a very different way, and also to think about me in a very different way, because the book is very much a personal memoir. But I think we have to give ourselves the opportunity to have time and the freedom to be visionaries, because we do that so well. I think it's part of our natural intellectual process to be problem solvers and to vision. But we have to ask ourselves, why are there so few physicians who are doing visioning work? Why is it that the voice we hear on TV from medicine is Sanjay Gupta? Why are we not hearing other people who are telling these very important stories from communities who are so deeply impacted by how the medical system is affecting them and how life is affecting them? So for me, the visioning quest was seeing these things and actually giving myself time to sit down and reflect on them and to write about them. And then the fifth sort of step is, if you can jump through all those hoops, so if you can be curious, if you can commit yourself to a process of inquiry, if you can allow yourself to be transformed, and if you give yourself time to vision, then you can, that sets you up to be an advocate. And I think all of us who have done some advocacy in some way, and advocacy could be simply working with your patients on a one-to-one basis. Like, that is advocacy. We do it all day long. But I think it's also important to recognize that we do have voices as physicians, as allied health providers, and that if we commit ourselves to advocacy, our voices can be heard by many more people than we could have imagined. I never imagined that this podcast that we made together could have had 20 million listeners, which it currently does, or that I could have written a book that's been read by thousands of people now. So I would encourage all of you, all of us, to continue working towards this advocacy journey, but it takes a lot of commitment, and it also takes time, and it's going to take some change in our medical system to enable doctors to be able to start, thinking and living in a different way that brings forth, more creative opportunities. So those are my prescriptions for success. I hope that's helpful.
Well, Dr. Benjamin Gilmer, you have certainly picked up quite a bit of wisdom as a part of authorship of this book, as well as the way you've lived your life, I think. And I really appreciate you being here with me today to share your thoughts and share your wisdom. It's been very instructional for me. It's been very enriching for me, and I'm grateful that you were able to join us. Before we go, I want to give you an opportunity to tell our audience where you can be found, where they can get the book, where they can find you on social media, or anything else that you'd like to share, please.
Thank you, Randy. I appreciate our conversation today, really do. So I can be found at benjamingilmer.com. And on my website, there are links to the book. There are links to advocacy posts, and there will be more links in terms of learning more about the mass incarceration of the mentally ill. So that's the easiest place to find me. You can Google our podcast at Dr. Gilmer and Mr. Hyde. And the book can be found at all major bookstores, including Amazon. But I love to encourage people to support their local independent bookstores. Those are the ones that are still supporting our communities in creative ways. And even the smallest place in America usually has a little bookstore. So I would encourage you to support them.
I couldn't be any more enthusiastic with my agreement with that last point. Let's do support the independent booksellers. Dr. Benjamin Gilmer, once again, thank you so much for being with us on Prescriptions for Success.
Thank you, Randy.
Thank you so much for joining us today. You can really help us with a 5-star rating. That'll give our podcast much more visibility, and that helps us reach many more listeners. Exclusive content is available on our Patreon page, including membership-only material like personal rapid-fire Q&A sessions with our guests. To be sure you never miss an episode, visit our website at rxforsuccesspodcast.com to subscribe. And while you're there, learn how to get CME credit from CMify just by listening. Very special thanks to Ryan Jones, who created and performs our theme music, and also to Craig Clausen of Clausen Solutions Group, who edits the show. And remember, be sure to fill your prescription for success with my next episode.